Carl Jung once suggested something that most people were never meant to question out loud. Not because it was wrong, but because if you truly understood it, everything you were taught about God, faith, and authority would begin to shift. And if you're hearing this right now, it is not by accident. Something in you is already starting to see through the surface, not fully, not clearly, but enough to feel that what you were given as truth might not be the whole truth. And that feeling, that quiet discomfort, is not doubt. It is awareness beginning to wake up. Before we go any further, there is something important you need to hear clearly. The sense that something feels off, something feels constructed, something feels controlled rather than divine. That feeling is not your imagination. You are not overthinking, and you are not becoming cynical. What you are experiencing is the beginning of awareness. The difficult part is not the realization itself, but the loneliness that comes with it, the sense that you might be the only one questioning something that everyone else seems to accept without hesitation. You may have felt moments where you sat in silence and wondered why something that is supposed to feel sacred instead feels structured, managed, and strangely distant from the living experience of the divine. If you look closely at your own experience, you may recognize certain patterns. You may have noticed that instead of feeling closer to something spiritual, you sometimes feel dependent on an external system. You may have felt that instead of being guided inward toward understanding yourself, you were guided outward toward rules, interpretations, and authorities. There may have been moments when you questioned something internally, but immediately felt guilt for even asking the question. And perhaps the most confusing part of all is this. The deeper your questions became, the more resistance you felt, not encouragement. This is where the central phenomenon begins to reveal itself. What you are experiencing is not simply doubt. It is the tension between direct experience and inherited structure. It is the moment when something inside you begins to recognize that what is presented as absolute truth may actually be a system designed to organize belief, not necessarily to awaken it. And when that recognition begins, it does not come from rebellion. It comes from something much deeper, something within your psyche that is trying to move toward authenticity. If you have ever felt this shift, even slightly, even for a moment, hold on to that awareness, because it matters more than you think. And if you can recognize that moment where something inside you said, "This doesn't fully make sense," then you're already standing at the threshold of a deeper understanding. Now, the question becomes unavoidable. If the divine is real, if something sacred truly exists, then where did the institution come from that claims to represent it? And more importantly, why does it feel so different from the original message it claims to carry? To understand this, you have to step outside of assumption and look at history, not as something distant, but as something that shaped the very structure of belief you inherited. What becomes visible is not a sudden divine creation, but a gradual construction. The figure at the center of the original message did not establish buildings, did not create hierarchy, did not assign authority to a system. The teachings were simple, direct, and deeply personal. They happened in open spaces, in conversations, in moments of presence, not within controlled environments. But after that figure was gone, something changed. What began as a movement of individuals connected through shared experience became something that power could not ignore. And when power cannot ignore something, it does not always destroy it. Sometimes it absorbs it, it reshapes it, it organizes it in a way that can be controlled. This is where the transformation begins. What was once fluid becomes structured. What was once direct becomes mediated. What was once internal becomes externalized. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, something shifts from being an experience to being an institution. And once an institution exists, it must sustain itself. This is where psychology becomes essential to understanding what happened next. Because an institution that claims authority over something invisible must create a way for people to accept that authority. It cannot rely on direct experience alone, because direct experience would make the institution unnecessary. So instead, it develops mechanisms. The first mechanism is the creation of lineage, the idea that authority has been passed down in an unbroken chain, that legitimacy comes from succession rather than from direct connection. This creates a structure where questioning authority becomes equivalent to questioning the divine itself. The second mechanism is control over interpretation. If access to meaning is limited, then dependence is guaranteed. When individuals are discouraged or even prevented from engaging directly with the source, they must rely on intermediaries. And the moment interpretation becomes centralized, power becomes concentrated. The third mechanism is fear. Not fear in an obvious, aggressive form, but fear that is woven into belief itself. The idea that stepping outside the structure leads to separation, to loss, to punishment. This is not always spoken loudly, but it is deeply implied, and over time, it becomes internalized. When you look at these mechanisms together, something becomes clear. They're not spiritual in nature. They are psychological. They are methods of maintaining structure, not methods of awakening consciousness. But what makes this even more significant is not just how authority was established, but how the original message itself was gradually altered. If you return to the earliest teachings, you find something profoundly different from what is commonly presented today. The original message points inward. It speaks of something within you, something accessible, something immediate. It suggests that the connection to the divine is not distant, not delayed, not dependent on external validation. But over time, that message was reoriented. What was once internal became external. What was once present became postponed. The idea of something within was replaced with the idea of something beyond, something that exists somewhere else, somewhere you must reach, somewhere you cannot access on your own. This shift is subtle, but its implications are enormous, because the moment the divine is placed outside of you, the need for mediation appears. And the moment mediation appears, dependence follows. The same transformation can be seen in how change itself is defined. Originally, transformation was described as something deeply personal, something psychological, something that required confronting yourself, understanding your own nature, integrating the parts of you that you might prefer to ignore. It was not easy, but it was real. But this too was simplified. Instead of transformation, belief became the focus. Instead of inner work, acceptance became the requirement. And this shift is not accidental, because inner work cannot be controlled, but belief can be guided. And perhaps the most significant change of all is how identity itself was reframed. The original message suggests potential, possibility, the idea that you can grow, evolve, become something more integrated, more whole. But the institutional version often begins with deficiency. It begins by telling you that something is wrong, something is lacking, something needs to be fixed. And once that belief is accepted, the solution can be offered. When you step back and observe this pattern, a deeper question emerges. Why would such changes occur? Why take something that empowers and reshape it into something that creates dependence? The answer is not hidden. It is consistent with human behavior across history. Power seeks stability. Control seeks continuity, and systems that rely on participation must ensure that participation continues. If individuals were fully connected to something within themselves, if they experienced meaning directly, if they no longer required external validation, then the system would lose its function. It would no longer be necessary. So instead, a structure is created where the individual is positioned as incomplete, and the institution becomes the pathway to completion. This is not spirituality in its pure form. This is structure maintaining itself. And if you observe the outcomes over time, you can see that pattern clearly. Wealth accumulates, authority consolidates, influence expands, and all of it is justified through the language of something sacred. But language does not always reflect reality. And this brings you to the most important question of all. If the structure is not the source, if the institution is not the origin, then where does the real connection exist? The answer is not something new. It is something that has been present from the beginning, something that has been repeated but often overlooked. It is within you, not as a concept, not as a belief, but as an experience. But going inward is not something most people have been taught how to do. And more importantly, it is not something most systems encourage. Because the moment you begin to look within, you begin to encounter parts of yourself that are not comfortable, not simple, and not easily explained. This is what Carl Jung described as the encounter with the unconscious, the meeting with the deeper layers of the psyche where everything that has been ignored, denied, or suppressed continues to exist. When you turn inward, you do not immediately find peace. You find complexity. You find contradiction. You find the parts of yourself that do not fit the image you have been trying to maintain. And this is why most people avoid this path, not because it is wrong, but because it requires honesty. Jung understood that what people call God is often experienced psychologically as something within the totality of the self, something that emerges when the conscious and unconscious begin to come into relationship. Not as a figure outside of you, but as a deeper organizing center within your psyche. This is not something you're told to believe. It is something you begin to experience when you're willing to observe yourself without distortion. So the first step is not to replace one belief with another. It is to stop looking outward for validation and begin observing what is already present within you. This requires silence, not ritual. It requires attention, not instruction. When you sit with yourself without distraction, without trying to force meaning, something subtle begins to emerge. Thoughts pass, emotions rise and fall, but beneath all of that, there is something more stable, something that is not reactive, something that simply observes. Jung referred to this as part of the self, not the ego that identifies with roles and expectations, but something deeper. And this is where a different kind of relationship begins. Not a relationship based on obedience, but a relationship based on awareness. But this path does not stop at observation, because if you truly look within, you will encounter what Jung called the shadow, the parts of yourself that you have learned to reject, the aspects of your nature that do not fit the identity you have constructed. These parts do not disappear simply because you ignore them. They remain active, influencing your thoughts, your reactions, your judgments, often without you realizing it. The paradox is that what you reject within yourself often appears outside of you, in the people you criticize, in the behaviors that trigger you, in the emotions you try to avoid. And until you recognize that connection, you remain divided within yourself. This is why true transformation is not about becoming something new. It is about becoming whole. When you begin to acknowledge the shadow, not to act it out blindly, but to understand it, something changes. The energy that was previously hidden begins to integrate. What was once expressed unconsciously becomes available consciously. And this is where real change happens, not through belief, but through awareness. This process is not easy, and it is not immediate. It requires patience, honesty, and a willingness to see yourself without illusion. But it is also the only process that leads to something stable, something real, something that does not depend on external approval. And this is what was originally meant by transformation. Not adopting a belief, but undergoing a psychological shift. Not declaring faith, but developing awareness. From this perspective, the idea that you must rely on an external system to access something sacred begins to dissolve, because the more you understand yourself, the more you recognize that the connection you're seeking has always been present, not as an abstract concept, but as a lived experience. And this changes how you live, because once you realize that meaning is not something given to you from outside, but something that emerges from within, your relationship to authority begins to shift. You no longer follow blindly, but you also do not reject blindly. You observe, you question, you reflect. You begin to live more authentically, not according to imposed rules, but according to a deeper understanding of who you are. And this is where many people hesitate, because authenticity comes with responsibility. It means you can no longer rely on someone else to define what is right or wrong for you. It means you must engage with your own conscience, your own awareness, your own evolving understanding. But this is also where freedom begins. Not freedom as rebellion, but freedom as alignment. Because when you are aligned with yourself, you no longer need constant validation. You no longer need to prove your worth through external systems. You no longer need to suppress parts of yourself to fit into a structure that does not fully reflect who you are. And this is what many systems cannot offer, because their stability depends on consistency, not individuality. There is another layer to this that is rarely discussed openly. Over time, structures that begin as attempts to organize belief often become aware, at least at some level, of the gap between their origin and their current form. Decisions are made, interpretations are selected, certain ideas are emphasized while others are removed. This is not necessarily done with complete transparency, because transparency would invite questioning, and questioning would lead individuals back to direct experience. And direct experience cannot be controlled. Throughout history, There have been moments where groups gathered to define what would be included and what would be excluded, what would be accepted and what would be rejected. These were not purely spiritual moments. They were also decisions about structure, about authority, about continuity. And this is not a hidden secret. It is simply something that is rarely examined from a psychological perspective. Because once you see it clearly, something shifts. You begin to understand that what you were taught to accept as fixed may have been shaped by human decisions, influenced by context, by power, by the need to maintain a system. And this realization can feel destabilizing at first because it removes certainty. But what it replaces it with is something more valuable: clarity. And clarity does not come from being told what to think. It comes from being willing to see. So the final question is not whether you should reject everything you were taught. That is not the point. The point is whether you're willing to look beyond what you were taught and discover what is actually true in your own experience. Because once you do that, something becomes undeniable. You do not need permission to access something that is already within you. You do not need an intermediary to connect to something that is already present. You do not need to fear losing something that was never dependent on a structure to begin with. The connection you're seeking has never been separate from you. It has only been obscured. And once you begin to see that, the path forward becomes simpler, not easier, but clearer. You begin to spend less time searching outward and more time understanding inward. You begin to recognize that what you once called distance was actually disconnection from yourself. And as that connection returns, so does a sense of meaning that is not imposed, but discovered. This is not a conclusion. It is a beginning of a different kind of relationship with yourself, with your mind, with your experience of something greater than your individual identity. And it does not require a building. It does not require a hierarchy. It does not require permission. It only requires willingness. So now the question is not what you have been told to believe. The question is what you're ready to see. Are you still looking outward for something that has always been within you? Or are you ready to turn inward and face what is actually there? Because the moment you do, everything changes. Not all at once, but in a way that cannot be reversed. And that is where real transformation begins.